Global for hitting the ground running, for paying attention to the community benefits plan objectives that we put in place and making some good progress on that, as well as making sure that you brought on board a local contact that can help you navigate the waters here to ensure that we build on the progress and the success we've had during the construction phase. So thank you very much. Just had those two positive comments.
Hey everybody, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, anybody else have anything for Don?
As you can hear, we have the Las Vegas Stadium Authority meeting on, and trying to give you the
can you hear me?
Other show a part of it.
Yeah. So go.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Full panel.
Could I comment on? You always work in very difficult environments, so thank you. I know you got 70 days to go, but
72. 72. On shortcuts. Look, I'm happy to sit here or occasionally stand before you and accept the appreciation, but it really, the more than 2,000 people out there actively working on the project are the ones that deserve that credit. But I'm happy to accept it on their behalf.
please pass it on. So
We will.
Thanks, Don. We appreciate it. Okay, Jeremy, if you could provide a brief overview of the draft policy, that'd be great.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Agenda item number 9 is a review and potentially approve this suite access policy. As the Chairman indicated,
There it is.
This is put on as an action item.
There it is, folks.
But
You can hope you can hear it.
the board's normal policy is to introduce it for the first time, review it, consider it, and receive input on it, and then bring it back at the next meeting. And as the Chairman indicated,
Let me give you some
intended process
view of where we're
for
at.
today. With that, Mr. Chairman, we do have Mark Arnold on the line.
Hold on a second.
As part of the meeting, proper way to say that. And so, with your permission, I'd like to turn the microphone over to him for a brief overview in terms of the structure and elements of the proposed policy.
Welcome, Mark. I hope things are well with you and in Houston, but thanks for being with us.
I'm happy to be here. Can everybody hear me? I think I clicked on my microphone.
Yes, we're good.
Perfect. You guys have before you the stadium suite policy. As you may remember, that the authority has the right to one suite and the number of tickets, seating tickets, and standing room only tickets in that suite, and an allocation of parking passes should there be any parking passes to that suite. The stadium authority gets that suite free of rent, but has to pay for any food and beverage. The stadium authority gets the suite for all team games and certain other events with some exclusions, including UNLV as an exclusion. But it's principally for team games, both exhibition and regular season. So with that, the policy is structured basically with an application procedure, with an application that'll be set up on the authority's website for 3 types of applicants: economic development, community support, and civic fundraising. When you break those down, there first will be exhibition games, where will be reserved for youth organizations promoting the general advancement and well-being of people under the age of 18, and they will get the tickets for the exhibition games based on a lottery process. For the regular season team games and the other events, there will be a priority established of economic development first, community support second, civic fundraising third. Economic development is defined as to individuals and organizations responsible for generating economic activity, creating jobs, increasing tourism, and other general economic development and tourism activities in Clark County. In the economic development category, the Las Vegas Global Economics Alliance and the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Authority will each receive 1 game of their choice first off the bat, and it'll rotate every year who chooses first among those 2. And then for the other regular season games, there will be a lottery in the economic development category, but no more than 4 regular season games, including the 2 to the LVGA and the LVCVA, will be allocated to the economic development category. The next category is community support, which are for nonpartisan, non-political, charitable, nonprofit, or civic organizations that promote and support and appreciate the community programs and services provided in Clark County region. These applicants are generally nonprofits. There'll be a lottery process for them. These are the applicants that have the tickets for themselves and their volunteers, and no more than 3 regular season games will be used for them unless there's not enough in the economic development category, and then then those games will flow down here to this category, and no more than 5 will be in this category. The final category is the civic fundraising category, which are the same types of organizations as the community support category, but here the tickets to the games can be used as a fundraising auction item, as you see in a lot of these a lot of the nonprofit auctions. And there'll be a lottery process for that based on applications, and no more than regular season games will be allocated there. The policy makes clear that public officers or public officials are permitted under the policy to access the suite as a host or sponsor of the other organizations or individuals. The policy also makes it clear that any food and beverage is not free of charge and will have to be paid for by the organization. And the stadium authority could perhaps require a deposit for the organization towards the cost of food and beverage. The authority will also keep a list and record keeping of the types of events and names of individuals who are attending and the individual's employer and organization and the public purpose for whoever gets tickets. So that will be generally public information. Parking passes will be allocated to ticket holders. We do not anticipate that there's one parking pass for each ticket. So they will be allocated generally. Of course, we've drafted this policy to maximize the return and public benefit of the taxpayers' investments to the suite. And everybody must comply with this suite policy and also with the rules and regulations that the Raiders and their stadium events company will put on access to the premises, just like if you were a regular ticket holder, and you have to comply with the rules and regulations of the stadium. Attached as an appendix to this suite policy and referenced generally herein are the rules and regulations that public officials need to be concerned about in terms of Nevada state law and what they have to comply with when accepting tickets. It's essentially anti-bribery statutes that this policy does not run afoul of. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Chairman,
Should ask questions on this one.
who controls or who has ultimate say on any or all of that? How's that going to really work?
Oh, here it
So
comes.
the way the policy is set up, the applications will be sent in to authority staff, and authority staff will confirm that the applications meet the requirements for the various games. The application form has on it a suggestion, or a place where you want to say, hey, I want to go to the Raiders when they play the Texans, and I want to go to that game, and it's on October 24th, and here's my application for that, and I am an economic development person. And so they'll look at all the economic development applications for that game, and they will choose sort of randomly by lottery or by lot after the LVCBA and the LVGEA get their 2 games, if it were an economic development person.
Authority staff being you.
In
this
Jeremy's
is
staff.
Just to put a point on that. The process would, as it's written right now, be managed by Jeremy and Applied Analysis. We would intend to go through the lottery process itself at a board meeting and do that in public so that we can build up interest in our board meeting.
Exactly. Bill Hornbuckle laughed.
Answer or have answered any more questions that members of the board have. We have a couple of minutes to think through this. I mean, I want to
I'm right there with you, Hornbuckle.
Trying to think about
Boy, oh boy.
the best way to structure the initial draft and anticipate what we think some may see as the right use of the state, the right proportional use this week. I think of exhibition games versus regular season games, and potentially other events as well. Trying to determine a process that would provide both broad access to the suite as well as make sure that it's in keeping with all the conversations that we've had both at the tourism committee and also here at the board as we thought about that tweet. So as turns along, you have questions or comments, please feel free to either let me, probably let Jeremy know, and then we'll put that in as we potentially draft it and bring it back to the full board meeting. Anybody else have anything else on agenda? Okay, we'll close agenda item 9, move on to agenda item 10.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Agenda item number 10 is to review and potentially approve the
I don't know what happened to the sound.
priority home games scheduled for the 2021 through 2027 seasons per section 29.3G24 of Senate Bill 1 of the Nevada State Legislature. Mr. Chairman, as we have discussed early on in this process, Senate Bill 1 requires that UNLV's football schedule be approved by the Stadium Authority Board. This has been what is before the Stadium Authority Board today is the result of a substantial amount of discussion between the Raiders organization and the folks at UNLV. I do want to express my thanks to both groups for all of their work in working through this. It is not easy. It is not an easy or simple task in any way, shape, or form, particularly on an opening year of the stadium. Both parties have worked together remarkably well, and although there have been some reports to the contrary, both parties have been working in the best interest of this community and to get this stadium open and to ensure that UNLV has a wonderful home field experience at Allegiant Stadium. Mr. Chairman, you will notice that there is a footnote that was provided in order for us to meet the scheduling deadline. Both UNLV and the Raiders have been working on making some adjustments to the schedule. One, to allow UNLV to be able to play at Allegiant Stadium on September 12th, the Arizona State game that's included there, while at the same time trying to get the Colorado State game moved from a Saturday game to a Friday game in order to ensure that there's plenty of time to transition the stadium in its inaugural year. I'm pleased to report that agreement has come to fruition. It's been approved by all of the required conferences and all the parties that are necessary to provide their assent. And so that particular element can most certainly be, could be removed for purposes of approval today because it has been satisfied, and I think as was reported in the media yesterday, is now publicly known to everyone. In addition to that, I do want to point out that early on in the negotiating process, as we were working through the scheduling and how all of this would work as part of all of the major agreements, including the joint use agreement between UNLV and the Raiders, there were challenges, and that both parties came to that and agreed in terms of where games would be played, including the expectation that 2 games would not be played at Allegiant Stadium. That has existed for the better part of the past 2 years. But again, just to reiterate what I said previously, UNLV coming together with the Raiders, keeping an open mind and trying to use whatever flexibility they can to ensure that home field for UNLV, even in the inaugural year, even with all of the activity that happens early on in a season, is why this schedule can be brought to the Stadium Authority Board today. So if there's any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. I know Mr. Newcomb is with us today. I want to make a special thanks to him. He's worked remarkably hard to get this where it is, as well as the folks at ASN. With that, if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Any questions from the board on the schedule?
Mr. Chair, this is Ken Evans. Once again, another positive comment. First to my colleague, Board Member Newcomb, and then beyond that, I want to commend both UNLV as well as the Raiders for pulling this off and getting us to an even better expected result, as Mr. Aguero pointed out. I can remember coming to the Southern Nevada meetings, as well as before that, some of the legislative sessions where we talked about a new stadium for UNLV. So very glad to see us get to this point and looking forward to them being in this stadium. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Anybody else?
Chairman, Mike Newcomb for the record. Just echo what Jeremy said. Special thanks to Mr. Bedane, Mr. Ventrelli, and Mr. Aguero for making this happy occasion for UNLV. We can't be more excited to be a partner over there. Look forward to the next season and beyond.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, I'd entertain a motion to approve.
Ken Evans.
We're moving second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great. Thank everybody for your work on this. We all appreciate it. Okay, we'll close agenda 10, open agenda item 11.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Agenda items 11, 12, and 13 are the extension of the professional services contracts the Stadium Authority Board has for legal services, for accounting services, and for general administrative services. The first of these is the review of potential, is for the Stadium Authority Board to review and potentially approve the proposed amendment to the Hunton Andrews Kurth professional services agreement with the Stadium Authority for fiscal year 2021, and if approved, to authorize the chairman to sign the amendment. The professional services agreement extension has been provided to you. Mr. Haynes has it up on your screen for review. The hourly rates for this contract have remained unchanged, and it reflects a time and materials engagement in which the Stadium Authority Board will only be charged for the hours that are actually incurred. Mr. Chairman, from staff's perspective, Mr. Arnold and his team, as well as the fine folks at Brownstein Hyatt, have been instrumental throughout this process and continue to provide insight, help, and assistance on any number of critical issues that we have before the Stadium Authority Board. So as the board considered this, I certainly want to extend my thanks for all of their efforts over the past 3 years.
Chairman, any questions? If not, I'd entertain a motion to approve.
So moved, Ken Evans.
Second, Jan Jones Buckhurst.
Thank you. A motion and a second. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Great. Thank you, and thanks, Mark. We appreciate all the work you've done on our behalf, and look forward to continuing to work with you.
Thank you, me too.
12, Jeremy?
Yes, sir. Agenda item number 12 is to review and potentially approve the proposed amendment to the professional services agreement with Reuben Brown to provide general accounting services to the Stadium Authority for fiscal year 2021. And if approved, to authorize the chairman to sign the amendment. Again, this is an action item. Again, you'll recall that about a year ago, the Stadium Authority Board entered into an agreement with Reuben Brown, who's assisted, frankly, staff in all types of projects, most notably processing all of the review of the accounting necessary for the pay applications. In addition to that, Ruben Brown is also currently assisting the Stadium Authority Board, working with the make sure that we are properly accounting for the cost of Sam Boyd Stadium as it is prepared to close down as Allegiant Stadium opens up, with Senate Bill 1 requiring that closure in order for UNLV to receive up to $3.5 million a year for a 10-year period to offset the costs associated with that. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd also like to point out that the terms of the agreement are unchanged, again, as well as the hourly rates. This is also a time and materials contract that Ruben Brown bills the Stadium Authority Board for time actually incurred.
Thank you, Jeremy. Any questions from the board? Can I entertain a motion to approve?
Tommy White, motion to approve.
Ken Evans, second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any?
Aye.
Great. Jeremy, agenda item 13.
Agenda item number 13 is to review and potentially approve the proposed amendment to the Applied Analysis Professional Services Agreement with the Stadium Authority Board for fiscal year 2021, and if approved, to authorize the chairman to sign that amendment. This too is an action item. Mr. Chairman, our firm, Applied Analysis, is responsible for providing general administrative support for the Stadium Authority Board. This contract will allow us to continue to do so through the next fiscal year, consistent with both the extensions provided by both Hunt and Andrews Kurth as well as Ruben Brown. Applied Analysis hourly rates remain unchanged. The structure of the contract remains unchanged and will continue for the next fiscal year.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. And I know everybody on the board and thanking you and your staff for the great work that you have done. And frankly, we wouldn't be here today without that work and your expertise and guidance in place. Thanks for that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any questions from the board? I would entertain a motion.
So moved. Second, Tommy White.
Motion and a second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? And that's unanimously as well. Okay, we will we'll move on. We're going to take the next three agenda items just slightly out of order. We're going to go 15, 16, and then back to 14. Jeremy, if you would open up agenda item 15, would be great.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Agenda, sorry, bear with me for just 1 minute. Agenda item 15 is to review and potentially adopt and authorize the chairman to sign a resolution to augment the fiscal year 2020 Stadium Authority Fund, that's Fund 2960, budget for this is again a possible action item. Members of the Stadium Authority Board, these three items are essentially for augmentations that are necessary for the FY 2020 fiscal year. There have been a handful of changes. I'm going to walk through them with you. Mr. Chairman, unless you advise otherwise, I'll walk through agenda item number 15. I'll walk through agenda item number 16. And I just want to point out that agenda item number 14 is essentially a summary of those two things. It essentially provides a summary of all the transfers that need to occur as a result of that. So within the information that was provided, what is labeled as agenda item 15 materials is an augmentation to to Fund 2960. And in that document, you are going to see a resolution to augment the Stadium Authority. And I know this seems perhaps overly formal, but this is the normal and customary way in which budgets are augmented at a governmental level. Essentially, there are a number of whereases, and these whereases identify that there have been revenues and transfers in that were adopted by the Stadium Authority Board early on that totaled $49.6 million. And then it's another whereas that the beginning fund balance of the Stadium Authority Board was determined to actually be somewhat higher than that, about $2 million higher than that. And this is the result of a reclassification of items as they relate to the budget. On the third page of that document is a summary of these changes. It has 3 columns, and Brian has it up on your screen now. The first of those 3 columns is the final budget that was originally approved. The second are the revisions to that budget, and the third of those columns are the augmented budget overall. I'd like to highlight a few of the changes that occurred so that they're clear and on the record. I would also like to point to the very last line on this schedule, which has the same numbers I just mentioned in the resolution. 49.6 million originally, 2.028 million in terms of the revision, and then $51.6 million that it reflects the augmented budget overall. And there are both pluses and minuses that result in that $2 million. And I'm just going to walk through a few of them. And in column 2, you'll make it out of 13 million. This is the result of room tax revenues coming in lower than expectations as a result of the changes in the economy we have seen recently. We'll talk more about those as we get into the Stadium Authority Board's final budget, but that is a necessary augmentation as we go from 2020 to 2021. In addition to that, you'll see that the beginning fund balance has been increased by $15.6 million. This was the balance remaining in FY 2019 from the debt reserve and the waterfall. You'll recall that we needed to work with the county to make sure that that was processed appropriately, but it was actually processed in FY 2020 as opposed to being processed in FY 19. So it needs to be augmented to reflect that it was actually part of the ending fund balance from the prior year. Operating expenses have decreased by 1.3 million. This is the first line item or second line item under expenditures. The Stadium Authority Board has an administrative budget every year of $2.166 million, $2 million actually adjusted for inflation each year. The Stadium Authority Board does not spend all of that money. It runs relatively efficiently, and the augmented budget would suggest that those will be about $900,000 to operate the Stadium Authority Board this year, which leaves $1.266 million that has to be augmented in the state's budget. Those dollars will ultimately roll in to the waterfall and be utilized either for debt reserve or ultimately for capital programs or other waterfall-related activities. Transfers out. If you see the other uses, you'll see transfers out and a waterfall fund change due to the above augmentations to the Stadium Authority Board's budget. In the budget, you'll notice that the debt reserve and debt service was combined into a single debt service fund, 3960. This is something that has already happened. And so when you see that two fund 3960 of $9 million, all we're doing is making sure that the debt reserve is being properly allocated to its appropriate fund. Instead of having all the debt service and the debt reserve in one lump sum, it's now separated into 2 parts, so it's being properly accounted for and consistent with Senate Bill 1's waterfall requirements. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer any questions relative to the augmentations to Fund 2960. In addition to that, Mr. Zagallo as well as Ms. Danchek are also available should the Stadium Authority Board have any questions that I cannot answer. I won't thank them on every one of these items. I realize I already thanked them once, but I would be remiss if I didn't reiterate as we get into these budget items just how helpful the county staff has been in terms of getting all this done and done correctly. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to take any questions on agenda item 15, which is the augmentations to operating fund 2960.
Any question from the chairman?
Yeah, pardon me, Mr. Chair, it's Ken here.
Good, Ken.
Okay. Forgive me if this is out of order, but in light of what's happening, will that show up in an augmentation of the tail end of this budget, or will that be in our FY21 budget?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Evans. With your permission, Mr. Chairman, we are seeing both of those things. Mr. Evans. What you're seeing is on this schedule that I just showed you, you'll see that $13.6 million reduction in room tax. That is a reflection that room taxes are coming in under expectation and that a budget augmentation is required for the FY 2020 year. As we get down to budget items, agenda items 17 and 18, I'll be walking through the budget detail that includes consideration of how those have been changed, by how much they've been changed, and you'll see some of this be repeated there. But to your question, Mr. Evans, this is both augmenting the 2020 budget to reflect reality today, as well as preparing us for the 2021 budget that will be open for consideration from the Stadium Authority Board in a few items.
Thank you.
Other questions? Approve.
So moved.
Tommy White, second.
Motion second. All in favor, please state aye.
Aye.
Okay. Item 16, Jeremy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Agenda item 16 is very similar to agenda item 15. However, instead of talking about the Stadium Authority Operating Fund 2960, we're now talking about the Stadium Authority Waterfall Residual Fund 2965. The Waterfall Residual Fund is essentially any monies that come into the Stadium Authority Board that are not used for either the administration or the repayment of debt flow into the Stadium Authority Waterfall Residual Fund to be used for waterfall-related items as they actually come up. Consistent with the way we walked through agenda item number 14, I'd like to do the same thing for agenda item number 15. The resolution that is provided here that if this is approved, the chairman would be asked to execute, essentially puts the public on notice that the Stadium Authority Waterfall Residual Fund for the Clark County Stadium Authority had a budget of $7,228,099 in July 1 of 2019. However, because of changes in the way that these funds are accounted for, including what we just talked about, they now total $17.1 million. And essentially what this resolution will do is provide for the adjusted accounting associated with that. If you were to flip to the next page, again, there are three columns: the original budget, the revisions, and then the augmented budget on the right-hand side. I'm going to focus my attention on the column that's labeled 2, which is the revisions overall. Under that, there are a number of changes. Number 1, revenue increased by $12.3 million. You'll see that there, which shows a transfer from 2960, the Stadium Authority Board. This is primarily due to the waterfall transfers that we just talked about, the additional money going into the waterfall that we just spoke about a moment ago. The beginning fund balance is reduced by $2.5 million to reflect the actual cash balance of $352,000 reported in the final 2019 financial statements. You'll notice here that under the expenditures that there is $7.3 million that was originally identified for potential capital outlay. These are no longer going to the outlay. This is simply a holding category that the Stadium Authority Board put its waterfall revenue into in case there was a need to utilize those funds for actual capital outlay. Instead, those monies will flow in to the ending fund balance. In addition to that, there's a transfer to debt service. You'll see that about 3/4 of the way down the bottom. This is the $9 million. And again, recall that instead of moving all of the money together to the debt service fund, we're actually transferring the additional funds that go to the reserve each year as a separate line item. That's the $9 million that you see listed here. When all of these are summed together, you'll notice the bottom of our of this particular schedule shows the $7.3 million that we started with, the $9.8 million revision, and then the total of $17.126 million that needs to be reflected as the augmented budget for the Stadium Authority Board's residual authority waterfall residual fund 2965. Again, Mr. Chairman, if there are any questions, I'm more than happy to attempt to answer.
Questions from the board for Jeremy?
Oh, ask
I
questions.
entertain a motion to approve.
Ugh. Ask.
Tommy White, motion to approve.
Ask about projections.
For a motion and a second, all in favor, please say aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Great, thanks. Agenda item 14, Jeremy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Agenda item 14, again, is a relatively simple agenda item. It essentially summarizes everything we just spoke about from agenda items 15 and 16. Again, it's for review and potential approval by the Stadium Authority Board as a possible action item. If you go to the second page of this agenda item, you will see a schedule that reflects the transfers in and the transfers out from each fund. This does nothing more than essentially recap the payments that are provided to Stadium Authority Board Fund 2960, the operations of the Stadium Authority Board, and Stadium Authority Waterfall Residual Fund 2965. Mr. Chairman, if the board has any questions, I'm happy to walk back through how these tie into those schedules, but hopefully it's relatively self-explanatory.
Thanks, Chairman. Any
He
questions?
said the agenda out
board?
of turn, but I get what he's saying.
Accept the motion to approve.
Yeah, just
So
go ahead.
moved.
Yeah. Yes.
Tommy White, second.
A motion and a second. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, that passes as well. We will move on to our conversations about the budget. We will start by holding a public hearing on the budget. So I will call the public hearing to order and turn it over to Mr. Guerrero.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Agenda items 17 and 18 are the tentative budget hearing and the final budget approval or consideration of the final budget for purposes of the Stadium Authority Board for FY 2021. A couple of things that I'd like to reference as agenda item 17 is that the tentative budget is originally created. There's a reference compliance letter for the record that has been included here. The Clark County Finance Department submitted the Stadium Authority's fiscal year 2021 tentative budget to the state of Nevada back in April in accordance with the requirements of Nevada state law. There have been a handful of changes since the tentative budget. This includes an $8.2 million transfer from the Waterfall Residual Fund to the Debt Service Fund that was eliminated in order to ensure that the Waterfall Residual Funds remain intact, and capital expenditures in the Capital Projects Fund that were increased by $9.6 million to zero out the ending fund balance, since all of the capital funds are currently expected to be spent by the end of FY 2021. This will essentially be summarized and delivered to these differentials will be summarized and delivered to the Department of Taxation as the final budget is ultimately approved. With that, Mr. Chairman, it is my understanding, and Mr. Haynes or Mr. Zagala will correct me if I'm incorrect, but I believe at this point it's appropriate to take any public comment as it relates to the tentative budget, and then we will walk through the final budget.
Hey, Jeremy. Go ahead, Brian.
Mr. Chairman, Brian Haynes for the record. The raise hands option is available for the public attendees during the public comment hearing. They're welcome to select that to indicate they wish to speak. As of yet, there are no one is signaling that they would like to speak. Then we could monitor that for a few seconds, and I'll let you know if anyone does.
So there you go. If you want to speak, or you can go and raise your hand.
No one has indicated they would like to speak, Travis.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Jeremy, do you want to move on to 18, or do you want to act on 17 first?
Mr. Chairman, I think it'd be appropriate to take 17 and 18 together. And so if it will please the board, I will transition over to my overview of the 2021 final budget for consideration of the board.
That'd be great.
Thank you, sir. With that, Mr. Haynes is going to put up a presentation that we have that I provided, that we have prepared, forgive me, on the final budget. In addition to that, I do want to point you to materials for Section 18 on your agenda. Those materials include the final budget. They include the transfer memorandum, the table of contents, and a number of schedules that are provided in the form and format that is required for transmission to the Nevada Department of Taxation for the State and Board's final budget for FY 2021. Schedules that are more important relative to being able to explain what the Stadium Authority Board's specific how the budget itself is specifically structured. And Brian will put up the 4 budget funds that the Stadium Authority Board has, and so I'm going to focus on those schedules in particular. Number 1 is Fund 2960, the Stadium Authority Operating Fund. The second is Fund 4960, the Stadium Authority Capital Projects Fund. The third is Fund 2965, the Stadium Authority's Waterfall Residual Fund, and then finally Fund 3960, the Debt Service Fund. And these do exactly what they sound like they do. The Stadium Authority Operating Fund is the fund from which revenues are collected and ultimately distributed to the other fund. The Capital Project Fund, and where the bond proceeds are held and how dollars are sent out to the individuals, are sent out to make sure that the bond payments are ultimately made. And the Waterfall Fund is the fund that holds all the waterfall dollars, and then ultimately the Debt Service Fund, where the debt service is specifically allocated from. I'll begin our conversation with Fund 2960. And in doing that, what we've done is essentially highlight the sort of main page, if you will, from this fund. And this is the summary schedule that's within your packet for Operating Fund 2960. At the very top of that is the current year fiscal estimate for FY 2020. I'm going to walk through FY 2020, and then I'm going to walk through FY 2021. Consistent with Mr. Evans' question early on, the expectation for 2020 after the augmentation that was just approved by the Stadium Authority Board is that revenues will come in at about 30, room tax revenues, will come in at about $35.9 million. This is roughly 29% below the budgeted expectation of $49.6 million, and I should say is about a little more than 30% below where revenues were expected to come in prior to COVID-19. Beyond that is $87,000 in interest charges, in interest earnings that the Stadium Authority Board is expected to receive during FY 2020. This is followed by about $900,000 in operating expenses. Again, those operating expenses came in under expectations. You'll recall the Stadium Authority Board just augmented that to reflect the $900,000 expectation in FY 2020. In addition to that, there's a $16.7 million transfer into the Waterfall Fund. Again, this includes the $9 million debt reserve and about $6.1 million that was transferred into the Waterfall that was earned in FY 2019, but was not transferred into the Waterfall Fund until 2020. Finally, there's a $34 million transfer to the Debt Service Fund. This is exactly what it sounds like. This is the debt service that ultimately needed to be paid by the Stadium Authority Board and it transferred into the Debt Service Fund, so that is appropriately accounted for by the Stadium Authority Board. The The summary that is provided on the next slide compares FY 2020 estimate for pre-COVID versus FY 2020 estimate for post-COVID for the Stadium Authority Board. You see the difference between the operations, the debt service, debt reserves, and the waterfall ultimately being included there. But most notably is the differential in terms of room tax revenue. As the room tax has come in lower than was expected prior to COVID-19, the amount of revenue is lower. However, I do want to point out that the differential, particularly within debt service, is unchanged from what it was. That is to say that the Stadium Authority Board and the county will have sufficient revenue to ensure that the debt service is met for FY 2020. And a matter of fact, the expectation is that roughly $1.1 million will actually be transferred into the debt reserve for FY 2020. Again, this is a function of two things. One is the 1.5 times coverage that was required when Senate Bill 1 was originally passed, as well as the 2 times debt service requirement, as the chairman indicated, which any number of board members, but most notably our now governor, thought was essential in order to making sure that the Stadium Authority Board's finances were solid as they could be going into this project. If we jump forward under the to 2960 FY 2021, you'll see the expectation going into the next fiscal year for the operation. This shows $17.9 million in room tax revenue, which is 50.1% below the initial revenue estimate, and about 2/3 below where we would have expected it to be absent COVID-19. If we look at the interest earnings, they're expected to be less. The reason the interest earnings are expected to be less is because there's less money in the accounts to actually earn interest as we draw down on the activity and generate less revenue overall. In addition to that, there are $2.2 million in operating expenses. I believe that the State Authority Board will actually come in under that expectation, as it has in years past. Nonetheless, this is the amount that is allocated in accordance with Senate Bill 1 for the operations of the Stadium Authority Board itself. Again, if we're going to go through the process, I missed one page. There's an additional $15.7 million that's a transfer to the debt service fund. Again, not unlike what you saw in 2020, these are the funds that have been collected and ultimately the ones that need to be transferred for whatever revenues are available towards the debt service for toward the $34.7 million debt service requirement that the Stadium Authority Board will have in 2021. I think an easier way to summarize this is by looking at it the same way we did for FY 2020. On the left-hand side was the FY 21 budget pre-COVID-19. On the right-hand side was the post-COVID 2019, and you'll notice a number of different elements associated here. Number one, obviously room tax revenue coming in under expectations. The room tax is budgeted to be about 66% below pre-COVID-19 estimates overall. The $2.2 million for operations will be spent. Again, whatever comes in under that will roll in and be available for debt service and then ultimately the waterfall. But the debt service reserve, UNLV transfer, capital fund, and the waterfall residual are expected to see zero revenues in FY 2021 because simply there isn't enough revenue flowing in to ultimately have enough money for the debt service. What does that mean? It means that the $19 million shortfall in debt service will need to come out of the debt service reserve that currently exists. Again, I want to point out that this is a portion, but certainly far from all of the money that is available in the debt service reserve, which is in excess of $67 million today. As we look forward to 2022 and even 2023, certainly the expectation is that the market will recover and the Stadium Authority Board may very well have to take additional funds in later years. But during FY 2021, there is more than sufficient revenues between the revenue that is expected with a 66% decline in collections, as well as the debt service reserve that exists today to ensure that the Stadium Authority Board meets all of its obligations. The next of the funds I'd like to talk about is Fund 2965, the Stadium Authority Board Waterfall Residual Fund. This fund has revenues because there is interest also earned on the funds that are held in this particular account. In 2020, those were $25,600. In addition to that, there's a $16.7 million transfer from the operating fund. Again, this is what we talked about in terms of those budget augmentations. These are revenues that were earned in 2019. And they include the $9 million debt reserve and the $6.1 million waterfall transfer. Again, simply being moved to the proper place for accounting purposes. The $9 million transfer to the debt service fund is also reflected at the bottom of this schedule. This is the annual reserve for 2019 transferred into that reserve account in FY 2020. Finally, there's an ending fund balance for the reserve of $8.1 million. Again, reflecting the amount that was transferred in, less the $9 million ultimately transferred to the debt service fund for the Stadium Authority Board's bond reserves. In FY 2021, the amount of the interest earnings increases slightly to $30,900 as there's more money for a longer period of time and ending fund. There are no other transfers expected into the waterfall fund. So it remains at $8.2 million per Senate Bill 1. These funds provide for early debt retirement, to make capital improvements, or to pay any infrastructure required on the stadium at the point that that is ultimately needed for the stadium project. Moving forward, Fund 4960 provides the Stadium Authority Board capital project. This is $3.8 million in interest earnings. These are the interest earnings on bond proceeds that are expected throughout the totality of FY 2020 overall. There's a $300 million in capital expense, which is very much a placeholder relative to the capital expenditures that will ultimately remain and be processed for the Stadium Authority throughout this year. I do want to make it clear that the Stadium Authority cannot transfer any more than $750 million toward the capital from the public's contribution, as well as the funds that are ultimately accounted for in terms of the PSLs. $3.8 million transfer to the debt service fund. These are interest earnings. I think it's important to note that any interest earnings that would have resulted in more than $750 million being available for capital are ultimately transferred to the debt service reserve. And finally, there's an ending fund balance of minus $246 million. This is one that I know has resulted in some questions in the past, but it is how the Stadium Authority Board is required to account for PSL. PSL revenue for the stadium construction is recorded by the Stadium Authority Board as revenue. However, it cannot be booked as an expenditure until the physical asset is completed. So it can't be recognized until the stadium is completed, which will occur in 2021. This will create a negative fund balance as we're required to carry it forward. You'll recall that the Stadium Authority Board addressed this budgeting requirement to make sure that we are consistent, or that the Stadium Authority Board is consistent with GASB overall. If we forward to FY 2021, there's the expectation of $114,000 approximately in interest earnings, again, on the bond proceeds. $500 million is held for estimated PSL revenue in terms of what we know is coming in and will be booked ultimately in FY 2021. Again, this is intended to be an approximation for the amount that the Stadium Authority Board is going to have to recognize as part of its accounting. The $254.4 million in capital expenses is merely the recovery of the funds that have been expended but couldn't be recognized in 2020. So that's the $254.4 million, which is just the opposite of the negative amount that you saw on the previous in 2020, or essentially that amount. Finally, you have $113.9 million that's transferred to the debt service fund. Again, this is the interest that is earned being transferred into the debt service to ensure that the public's contribution never exceeds the $750 million. Ultimately, the Capital Projects Fund, as the project is intended to be completed, balances to zero at the end in terms of the ending fund balance. Finally, is the Stadium Authority Board's Debt Service Fund. The Debt Service Fund in 2020 had $1.1 million that were in interest earnings on the funds that are held in the reserve, which also stay with the reserve for the Stadium Authority. In addition to that, there's a $34 million transfer to the the operating fund. This is the operating fund transfer that we saw from the 2960 account that's merely being accounted for here to ensure that the debt service payments are properly reflected in the appropriate fund. There's a $9 million transfer from the Waterfall Residual Fund to reflect the debt service account that is also held within the debt service fund. There's a $3.8 million transfer from the capital fund, which is simply the interest that was earned on those capital projects fund, which is also ultimately delivered to the debt service reserve. Finally, there's a $34 million transfer for the debt service payment that is ultimately the payment to the bondholders as a result of the bonds coming due, or at least the payment for FY 2020. Finally, is the $67.2 million debt reserve that is held within the debt service fund. If look at FY 2021, $1,000 to be earned in interest. Again, we're spending down the total amount of the budget reserves, which will reduce the amount of interest earning. $15.7 million is transferred from the operating fund. That's the room taxes that are collected during 2021 that need to be used to pay down, to pay the debt, the principal and interest of the debt. The $113,900 cap transfer from the Capital Projects Fund is the interest earnings on those bond proceeds. Finally, the $34 million for the debt service payment, and then the $53.4 million debt reserve, which is the ending debt reserve after the amount has to be reduced in order to ensure that sufficient funds are allocated for purposes of making the debt service payment shown previously. So stated otherwise, the expectation in terms on a cash basis relative to the debt reserves at the end of FY 2021 are still expected to be $53.4 million overall. With that, Mr. Chairman, that is the overview of the FY 2021 final budget for consideration by the Stadium Authority Board. I appreciate your indulgence while I went through that level of detail. Again, I'm here to answer any questions or as representatives from our county finance department should there be any technical questions.
Thanks, Jeremy. Question, Jeremy or folks from Park County on the budget?
Mr. Chair, Ken here.
Go ahead, Ken.
Yep. Thanks, Jeremy. Great presentation. Just want to make sure I understand something in summary before we vote. So what we're saying is that our debt service account is at $67 million at the end of FY 20, and that the deficit that will occur during FY 21, we won't really have to realize or deal with that deficit until the end of FY 21, at which time we'll take out that deficit and still have approximately $54 million in our debt reserves account.
That's generally correct, although the folks from the county will tell me that there are accrual versus cash-based accounting, which is why the numbers don't add up to 100%. But that is very close to exactly how those dollars are expected to be transferred. Mr. Evans, relative to the timing of those payments, I think it's important to note that the timing of those payments occur every 6 months, although the transfer to the debt service fund occurs every month as those revenues come in. So as those revenues are needed to ensure that the debt service funds are, the debt service amounts are available for both the principal and interest payments at the point at which those are required, that is the time at which those dollars will be moved from the debt service reserve to the debt service payment line item to ensure that that happens in accordance with the bond document. I would expect that will not occur at the end of the fiscal year, but will occur during the fiscal year as those payments come due every 6 months.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any question for Jeremy?
Yeah, what about the debt coverage ratio, Jeremy?
Okay.
Is it out of the window?
Public hearing. So if any member of the public would like to make comments related to agenda item 718 with respect to the budget, now's the time to do that.
Mr. Chairman, Brian Haynes for the record. If anyone would like to speak from the public, please use the raise hand feature and go to webinar software. Okay, we do have someone who would like to speak, Mr. Chairman. Art Abraham, I'm going to activate your microphone. Please unmute your microphone, Art, if you would like to speak.
Hello? Greetings. Actually, this is Zenny Abraham, and I'm calling with some friendly advice. From 1995 to 1999, I worked for Oakland Mayor Lee Harris as economic advisor, and I was responsible for, among other things, the Raiders and also the ticket matter with Rich Rogers, who was the CEO of the Oakland Football Marketing Association. We had a similar breakdown in terms of allocation as you propose, and I'm just explaining that I would advise you to favor nonprofits rather than what you propose, because over the last 23 years, it's caused a great many problems, ultimately winding up with the Oakland Public Ethics Commission most recently. Now, I personally agree that economic development people should be, this is my bias, rewarded, but I'm just explaining that what's proposed has some problems.
Thank you. Anybody else, Brian?
Muted.
Mr. Chairman, Brian Haynes for the record. No other speakers are indicating they would like to speak.
Okay, thank you. We will then close the public hearing, reopen the board meeting itself, and I did entertain a motion to approve item 1718.
Tommy White, motion to approve.
Ken Evans, second.
I have a motion and a second. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Great. 1718 passed. We will open agenda item 19, which is public. If any member of the public would like to address the board, follow the same directions that Brian has provided throughout the meeting.
Mr. Chairman, Brian Haynes for the record. Do not have anyone raising their hands at this point.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone on the board and everybody who contributed to the meeting. Nice job for our first time in this format, so we appreciate all of that too. With that, we will adjourn today's public board meeting. Take care, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Stay well.
So that's it, everybody. That was the meeting of the Las Vegas Stadium Authority, and hey, you know what? They did allow public. They did allow public comment. Excuse me. They did allow public comment, and to reiterate what I was explaining, we had a lot of problems with the kind of ticket allocations. Let me explain. I was hired to be Oakland Mayor Lee Harris Economic Advisor December 7th of 1995. The same day as Pearl Harbor. At any rate, he gave me responsibility for everything from redevelopment to the Raiders. And at that time, an organization was created as part of the Raiders agreement in establishing themselves in Oakland with a business relationship with the Oakland Alameda County Coliseum Joint Powers Authority, which consisted of the city of Oakland and the county of Alameda, and we call East Bay entities. And out of that, the Oakland Football Marketing Association governed, if you will, allocations of tickets to the public suite. And that was Suite 209, if memory serves, and at the Coliseum. And over the years, the original allocation was very much like what's proposed there. And the public officials had their favorites. And I'll say this rightly so, okay? Because my personal bias, and I expressed this in a blog post last year, essentially attacking the Ethics Commission, was that people who work hard to achieve the objective of landing, in this case, the Raiders to Oakland from Los Angeles, as was the case for Ezra Rapport, who was the assistant city manager at the time, a number of people, should be rewarded by at least, being able to go to a game if they wish. But the public doesn't agree. And that sentiment has only grown more and more, of course, leading up to prior to the Raiders' departure, right? And the Warriors as well, over the years, in basically direct proportion to the overall cost of living in the Bay Area, and most notably the cost of housing. So it became a huge issue, and it became a crescendo when the Warriors went to the NBA Finals for the first time. That was in 2015, and courtside seats were $29,000. Now you've got a similar situation coming up at Allegiant Stadium, and so those box seats are going to be coveted without question. And someone may accuse one of the economic development persons who were the recipients of those tickets of reselling them if that person doesn't show up to a contest. Okay, so they would be seen as being the recipient of a public ticket, not paid for by them, that then they profited on ostensibly for several $1,000s. So if you want to have a big scandal on your hands, that's a big scandal. I'm just saying, that's a huge scandal. The better way is to basically reverse the order. First dibs to nonprofits, and then last dibs to economic development, or really no dibs to economic development people. Because look, give, especially in the middle of a pandemic, you don't want that on your hands. Give those tickets to the people who can't afford them. I can afford them, you can afford them, but hey, you know what? You have people out there struggling right now. You're looking at almost 30% unemployment rate nationwide. And this is a worldwide problem. So my advice is to alter that. So there you go. So anyway, some hard times coming up. They have an underfunded debt service reserve. The debt coverage ratio 1.5 is basically out the window because, hey, look, you're not getting any money in to be able to claim that you have a debt coverage ratio of 1.5 to begin with. Okay, that was the way it was originally designed. That's out the window because of the pandemic model. Not only that, it was out of the window before the pandemic. All right. The solution is to fashion a bailout request to the White House and just politically march it with all deliberate speed. I don't care who you go to, who you employ for assistance. Sheldon Adelson is a great person to start with because, hey, you know what? He's a supporter of President Trump. So that's the direction I would go on. For those watching this, I'll be back later to talk more. Subscribe to Zenny62 on YouTube, and thank you very much for your time. And that ends this broadcast for now.